The most brutal thing a writer can do is not killing a character. It is dying before the character's fate is finished. That is the strange pain at the heart of the Brothers Karamazov. You reach the end, and it already feels enormous. The father is dead, the brothers are shattered. Faith and doubt have gone at each other with almost embarrassing intensity. Questions like whether everything is permitted without God are not whispered in the background. They are thrown at your face like explosives. The novel feels so complete that it is easy to assume Dostoevsky had already poured his entire soul into it and closed the door behind him. But what if he did not see it that way at all? What if this book, that later generations treated like a final testament, was, in his own imagination, only the opening move? What if the truly dangerous part, the more painful part, the part that would have brought us closest to his final answer, was the part he never got to write? Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today I want to sit with a question that hurts a little more the longer you think about it. What was Alyosha supposed to become? Where would Ivan's doubt finally take him? Was Dmitri's suffering an ending, or only the first step? And in the last years of his life, what kind of true ending did Dostoevsky really want to give these brothers? Blank page. It is not hard to understand why people treat the Brothers Karamazov as Dostoevsky's final answer. The novel is packed with the obsessions that shaped his whole life. You can feel the aftershock of the mock execution. You can feel Siberia in the background. You can feel all the ideas he kept circling for decades: freedom, suffering, the soul, guilt, grace, active love. They all collide here with frightening force. And maybe that is exactly why one crucial fact gets overlooked. Dostoevsky never wrote this novel as nothing more than a murder story. He was not simply interested in who killed the father. He was interested in what the father's death would do to the souls of the sons. That is where the book becomes merciless. Fyodor Pavlovich's death is almost like a fuse. The crime is only the device. The real explosion is spiritual. Dmitri carries one path. He is the path of appetite, passion, humiliation, embodied suffering. Ivan carries another. He is reason sharpened into rebellion, skepticism pushed to the point of psychic collapse. Alyosha looks gentler, brighter, more stable, almost like hope itself. But that may be exactly why he is the most unfinished of them all. He still looks like someone reality has not yet fully tested. So if the novel was meant to continue, then the first part was not solving the problem. It was staging it. It was not a conclusion. It was a setup. Dostoevsky was not telling us who was right and who was wrong. He was pushing three souls to the edge of a cliff and then asking the ugliest question possible: what happens next? Which means the version we have may not be the ending at all. It feels more like a map that stops mid-journey. The road already behind us is vivid and terrifying. The most important stretch is still blank. Alyosha. If there is one figure in this novel who feels like an unfinished project, it is probably not Ivan and not Dmitri. It is Alyosha. When readers first meet him, it is very tempting to treat him as Dostoevsky's final tenderness. He does not burn like Dmitri. He does not dissect the universe like Ivan. He seems quiet, warm, almost transparent in his goodness. Through him, and through Father Zosima, it is easy to think the answer has already been placed on the table: faith, love, forgiveness. The stubborn ability to see something divine in human beings even in the dark. But if it were really that simple, Dostoevsky would have had no reason to keep writing. The whole point is that Alyosha matters not because he looks good inside a protected moral frame, but because he has not yet been shattered by history. And Dostoevsky, especially late in life, had become deeply suspicious of easy answers that only worked on paper. This was a man who had stood before a firing squad, a man who survived prison camps, creditors, epilepsy, gambling, the constant humiliation of debt. He knew how quickly ideals could rot under pressure. For him, the real question was never whether a person could stay kind in safety. It was whether a person could enter desire, violence, shame, politics, betrayal, and pain without losing the soul. So the less Alyosha looks like a problem, the more he may actually be the biggest problem in the novel. Dmitri is visibly chaotic. Ivan is visibly split. Their danger is obvious. Alyosha alone looks almost too whole, and that kind of wholeness can feel suspicious in a Dostoevsky novel. You start to wonder whether it is real maturity or only innocence that has not yet had its teeth kicked in. Put differently, maybe Dostoevsky's real experiment was never just whether bad men can be redeemed. Maybe it was whether a good man can survive contact with reality without turning bitter, false, or cruel. If someone formed by monastic spirituality is thrown into the mud of history, if he is betrayed by people he trusts, contaminated by institutions he reveres, wounded by the very world he wants to love, can he still hold on to a form of love that is not sentimental and not cheap? That is why Alyosha fascinates me so much. He is not the answer, he is the test. Dostoevsky wanted to know whether love has any real durability, whether it can do more than produce tears, beautiful speeches, and spiritual moods, whether it can pass through shame, crime, suffering, and still remain alive on the other side. Brothers. Of course, the novel leaves more than Alyosha suspended. Dostoevsky was not done with Ivan or Dmitri either. Let us start with Dmitri. In the earlier video on debt, I mentioned that late Dostoevsky increasingly writes money as a spiritual problem. In Russian literature more broadly, from Gogol to Tolstoy to later Chekhov, money often exposes character. But in Dostoevsky, it becomes almost theological. Dmitri's debt is not just financial. It is humiliation made visible. It is desire turned into weight. It hangs around his neck like a small private cross. His recklessness is not just bad behavior. It is a man selling himself piece by piece to appetite, impulse, and shame. So the Dmitri we meet in the existing novel is not complete. He has only reached the doorway of suffering. His purpose is not merely to be a sensual man in chaos or a tragic victim in a courtroom. He is carrying one of Dostoevsky's deepest obsessions, whether a person can be remade through suffering. Not cosmetically improved, not cleaned up for appearances, remade from the bone outward. And then there is Ivan. Ivan is much harder, because he is not just an unbeliever, and definitely not a convenient villain. He is probably the most dangerous intellectual opponent Dostoevsky ever created. A lot of novelists invent skeptics in order to defeat them. Dostoevsky does something braver and much riskier. He gives Ivan his sharpest questions. He lets him speak with terrifying force. He takes the most merciless doubts in his own mind and lays them out in public. That is why the Grand Inquisitor chapter remains so haunting. Not simply because it is clever, but because it feels uncomfortably true. Can human beings really bear freedom? Or do most people actually want bread, security, and someone else to make the unbearable decisions for them? Dostoevsky writes this with such cruelty because he knew what it meant to be crushed by authority, by state power, by paternal systems that claim to know what is good for you. In that sense, the argument is not abstract. It comes out of lived collision with empire, punishment, and spiritual coercion. But here is the thing. Even Ivan does not reach an endpoint in the novel we have. He reaches the edge of mental collapse, yes. But collapse is not an answer. Collapse is a consequence. The harder question is whether someone who has doubted justice, God, innocence, and the structure of the world all the way down can still return to something livable. Not childish certainty. Not a fake happy ending, something tougher. A form of love or meaning that survives the abyss without denying it. So in the end, the current Brothers Karamazov does not feel like a final chapter. It feels like three men standing on the same precipice. One carries bodily guilt. One carries intellectual poison. One carries love, but love that has not yet taken its full beating from reality. Maybe the real novel Dostoevsky wanted to write was about whether they could fall and still crawl back alive. Part 2. And this is where the whole question becomes truly interesting. A lot of people treat the unwritten continuation of the Brothers Karamazov like a literary mystery. They wonder about plot, who would meet whom, who would go into exile, who would break down, who would die. I get the appeal, I really do. But that is not the deepest question. The deeper question is, why Dostoevsky, at the very end of his life, would still want to continue with these brothers at all. The answer may be painfully simple, because the question that mattered most to him had not yet been fully answered. If you place this beside the earlier episodes we did, the pattern becomes clearer. One episode dealt with debt and how money enters the conscience, how material pressure bends the soul out of shape. Another dealt with the mock execution and how proximity to death forced a man not merely to survive, but to begin living in a different register. If the Brothers Karamazov was meant to have a second movement, then perhaps its purpose was to bring all of these lines together. Can a person pass through doubt, desire, humiliation, money, guilt, failure, and suffering, and still arrive at a faith that is not cheap? That phrase matters. Not cheap faith. Not the kind that believes in light only because it has never seen darkness. Not the kind that gets hurt twice and suddenly turns wise. Not the kind that covers every contradiction with a soft little slogan about love. Dostoevsky was not that kind of writer. He knew too much about filth, weakness, seduction, violence, and self-deception. He knew why bread and order are always tempting. He knew why freedom terrifies people. Which is exactly why his final project may not have been the continuation of a crime novel at all. It may have been a larger spiritual trial. If the Father fails, and God is doubted, and law is compromised, and money corrupts, and the self is fractured, what is left for a human being to live by? Honestly, that question is Dostoevsky's whole life. It runs from Notes from the House of the Dead to Notes from Underground, from Crime and Punishment to The Idiot, from Demons all the way to the Brothers Karamazov. Again and again he returns to the same battlefield with different masks. By the end, it is as if he had set 3 possible answers before us. The answer of the flesh, the answer of reason, the answer of love. But he died before forcing them through the final test. Which means the unwritten continuation is not just an unfinished novel. It is an unfinished Dostoevsky. The author carried all his deepest questions to the threshold, and then history stopped him one step before the door opened. Silence. So fate played a very Dostoevskian joke. A writer who spent his entire life wrestling ultimate questions left behind an ultimate book with no true final resolution. The author died first. The question survived him, and because of that gap, the Brothers Karamazov feels different when we return to it now. It is not just a monument. Not just one more giant masterpiece that the classroom tells us to respect from a safe distance. It becomes dangerous again. Personal again. Alyosha, Ivan, and Dmitri stop feeling like completed characters and start looking like roads still extending beyond the page. In a strange way, the novel continues inside the reader. It goes as far as your own moral courage can take it. If you put this episode beside the previous 2, that becomes even more visible. The debt episode was really about how the world prices a human being. The mock execution episode was about how death can force a soul awake. And now we arrive at the next question. Once you are awake, what do you do? Once you have seen darkness, what then? Once you understand the price of freedom, how do you go on living? Maybe Dostoevsky wanted to give his own answer. Maybe he was already moving toward it. But he did not get there in time. Which means the most piercing thing about the Brothers Karamazov may not be what it tells us. It may be what it leaves unfinished. It shows us that a writer can dig almost unbearably deep and still fail to finish the answer. It also shows us that some questions may not even allow neat endings. Is freedom worth the pain it causes? Does suffering have meaning? Can love survive after doubt? Is faith a shelter? Or is it a fire? Those are not questions one book can seal up and shelve forever. And maybe the real ending of the Brothers Karamazov was never hiding in some lost outline. Maybe it exists in every reader who finishes Ivan, Dmitri, and Alyosha, and still cannot stop asking what a human being is supposed to become. If Dostoevsky did not get to finish that last half, then perhaps that is because the last half was always meant to be lived, not just written. Thanks for watching the video. See you at the next lighthouse.